Earthbound is a game series that means a lot to a lot of people all around the world. Ever since its initial release as Mother in July of 1989, it has had a profound impact on the people who have played it in pop culture as a whole, with the series even being recognized by many companies such as Arby's and Adult Swim, the latter of which in an effort to get the final game in the trilogy, Mother 3, localized outside of Japan. While yes, it is true it has often been recognized as one of the greatest games of all time, it has always been seen as sort of a niche title. That is why, in the next few episodes of Lost in Development, we will not only be discussing the lost and unseen and unused content of the Earthbound series, but also discussing the impact it has had on many platforms. In fact, to get started, we're going to take a look at probably the most niche out of the entire series, Mother, or as it's better known in the West, Earthbound Beginnings. With that said, I do want to say a little disclaimer. I will be going through most, if not all, of the content and lost content and stuff with the game. I skipped a few things that I didn't find interesting personally, and I didn't figure anyone else would really, but there will be something in the comments below with all the stuff that I decided not to put in video form just for my sake. Please don't watch this if you have any intent on playing Earthbound Beginnings or the Earthbound series at all, or you can. It's up to you. I'm fine either way. But Earthbound's a type of game you really should go into blind. Well, not this one really, but I'll explain it when the time comes. But Earthbound Beginnings, the one we're talking about today, is available on Wii U Virtual Console. And the sequel, Earthbound, is available on Wii U, 3DS, and Super Nintendo Classic. All sources are in the description and in the comments. So now that that's out of the way, I'm Mama Luigi, and let's go ahead and get started. In terms of the impact that this game has had, it is pretty influential. For one, the localization of the game helped build a stronger relationship between Nintendo of America and Nintendo Co. Limited, which is basically Nintendo of Japan. The way it built the relationship is that Nintendo of Japan employees saw that how much had to be changed in the US version, and they decided before the game even released that they would try to pre-localize the game, removing any content that Nintendo of America may see as non-family friendly and violate their guidelines. Another fun tidbit is that a lot of people who worked on this game and its successor, Earthbound, later went on to help develop the Pokemon games. The influence the game has had on the team is still present, as the well-known, and arguably one of the most well-known Pokemon, Mewtwo, seems to take many design elements from the primary antagonist of this game, Giygas. Also within the Pokemon series, the theme for Mounted Toy sounds very similar to the Indigo Plateau theme, and by extension, Red's theme from Gold and Silver. In fact, a lot of the music in this game has been used and modified since its release. Outside of Pokemon, the soundtrack had a large influence on the soundtrack of the game's sequel, Earthbound. Approaching Mounted Toy got remixed into Molten Minds, Monkey Caves got remixed into Saturn Valley. Yucca Desert got remixed into Dusty Dunes Desert. And Humoresque of a Little Dog became Buy Something, will ya? This in and of itself is pretty interesting, but nothing too shocking. Mother, when it was initially released in Japan, sold roughly 400,000 units. It was rated by a poll in Famitsu, a Japanese video game news publication, as the 9th best Famicom game and the 38th best game of all time. The game, at release, and still years later, is getting praised, both by critics and fans alike. The game often gets praised for how it handles dark themes with whimsicality. However, the game often gets criticized for its lack of properly balanced areas, the most infamous of which is Mount a Toy. Mount a Toy is regarded by many to be one of the most difficult moments in many retro games, with enemies even squashing you, even if you are severely overleveled. According to an interview with the game's producer, Shigesato Toy, this was because they got to Mount a Toy near the end of the development, and to prevent the game from being delayed and having bugs, he and his team basically decided to do whatever, making it incredibly difficult for new and well-seasoned gamers alike. In terms of Mother merchandise, there were Mother figures made by Brand Presto in 2010 for UFO Catcher prizes, released in waves, the first wave of Earthbound Beginnings having Ninten, Teddy, and Anna, while the second wave had Lloyd and Pippi. These figures were based on the clay figures used in promotional materials when the game was initially released in 1989. In terms of unused content for the entire series as a whole, the first by far has the least. This was likely to conserve memory, as it is a pretty large game for the time, boasting a whopping 40 songs, which is an absolutely insane amount for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Not to mention the large overworld that the game has. Anyway, let's have a look. First, let's look at unused graphics. To start, let's look at unused enemies and battle graphics. We have an unused sprite for a pillow-esque enemy that could have potentially been the first battle in the game instead of the lamp, as it wouldn't fit in anywhere else in the game aside from Ninten's house, and its stats are incredibly similar to the lamp, with the only difference being that the HP is 2 points lower than the lamp. Last, for unused enemies, we have the more interesting of the two. Pippi. Pippi is Ninten's neighbor who he rescues in the cemetery. However, you never have to fight her. The presence of the sprite seems to imply that Pippi may have been possessed, or something along those lines, while at the cemetery, and finding her would have initiated a battle to get her back to her senses. We can tell that this was to be used in the cemetery, as the enemy uses the same name pointer as the gang zombie in the files, which is an enemy only found in the cemetery. Her stats were completely wiped due to how low they are, but despite this she has an insane amount of PP, and at the point that she would have been used, enemies wouldn't have been using PSI attacks. The pixel art itself is a pretty faithful recreation of the Pippi clay figure used to help market the game and the UFO catcher figure based off the clay figures. That's all for unused enemies and battle sprites. Not that much, mainly because it is a massive game and all memory was incredibly limited, so it's a wonder that we even have these. Next up, we basically have an amalgamation of sprites that didn't really have their own section. Alright, first, we have an unused texture which is supposed to be used in the factory tile set. Yeah, there's not a lot to say for this one, as it's pretty self-explanatory. But next, we have an unused version of the Guitar Man NPC, where no guitar is visible. It may have been intended for just another type of NPC, as he does lose his one defining trait. However, it is far more likely that this was just an early or placeholder sprite for when the game was earlier in development. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Not a lot in this game in terms of unused sprites and textures, but we do have is pretty interesting. Well, at least the enemies are. But personal opinions aside, let's move on to the next part of unused content remaining in the code for Earthbound Beginnings. Next up, unused items. First, we have two items which are named Stone Origin and Poison Needle. These function exactly like the PSI tags of the same name, with Stone Origin turning the enemies into stone, and Poison Needle poisons enemies, obviously. But what's next is probably one of the most interesting unused items we have. It is of course called the IC chip. Its use is unknown. However, in the Game Boy Advance port, Mother 1+2, there's an item called the memory chip, which is given to you right after Eve dies, and it functions exactly like the Onyx hook. Except instead of teleporting the party to Magicant, it teleports them exactly to where Eve was destroyed. Based on how faithful the ports are in every other instance, it is incredibly likely that at one point or another this was the intended use of the IC chip. Remaining in the files, there's also an odd item simply named Debug. It was likely to never be used or even accessed by the player, based not only on the name, which implies it was used for testing purposes, but also the fact that in the initial Japanese release of Mother, using it would often cause unusual effects which more often than not led to the game crashing. This was changed in the English localization, where if used, a display that comes up that simply says, "Nothing happened." The last item we have is nothing special. It is called the Time Capsule, and yeah, it does nothing. It was meant to be used by a professor at school, but the entire sequence was removed for unknown reasons. When using the look command on it though, funnily enough you get a message that simply reads, "System error," with 3 exclamation marks. Finally, we have unused text. There is unused text that would have likely been used in Ninten's house while the Poltergeist was still happening. The text reads, "Spooky, the doll walks by itself." Next, we have an unused boss battle description for the fight with Teddy, or as it's known in the game, BB Boss. It reads, "Maybe he's not really rotten to the core." While it seems odd that it is unused, it is because the only action you can pick during the Teddy fight is the fight option, making the player unable to access this text. Lastly, we have unused text that would have appeared at the end of the game. This was to be used for a third captured citizen at the peak of Mount Atoy. However, there are only 2 interactable NPCs in the peak. The text reads, "Not that I have claustrophobia, but I can't stand small closed spaces." In terms of unused and unseen content, that's it. Or at least that's what I would say if it weren't to be for the fact that we have some pre-release footage. The footage, despite not being very long, has a lot of information. First thing of note is that we have a sprite for Ninten's telephone that was originally very different. The table it was located on was a lot larger. Then we get a look at the path that leads to Podum, but the path would have originally went to the west rather than the east. We can also see a different sign than the one that is used in the final game. Later on, we see what could possibly be the inside of the Rosemary Mansion. However, it appears that you need to go diagonally down the stairs based off the fact that the party is facing the player. The Yucca Desert Plain is also white and blue instead of red and white. Unrelated to the unused stuff, as this looks like it was probably just an error, but 2 of the previously mentioned signs are layered on top of each other with the top one covering the upper half of the first sign. Lastly, for pre-release footage, we see the party in the cemetery, but the enemies that they encounter normally can't be encountered together or at the cemetery. These being a Maniac Truck, which is usually fought near Marysville, a Big Widow, which can only be fought in Magicant, and a Sumo Zombie, which is normal for a cemetery. Fortunately for us, there's still more, and Lord, there's a lot that has changed since this footage was released. First, the exit to Ninten's room would have been to the right instead of to the left. This was likely changed, as leaving from the right but spawning to the left would have been a little weird and confusing for the player. We can also see that the chair in his room was changed from pink to white. Moving on, the room closest to Ninten's looks to be extremely similar, with the player not going far enough to see if there's any difference with the sister or the bed itself, but from what we can see, it is pretty much the same. Next up, in Ninten's other sister's room, the one with the doll boss fight, we can see that his sister's bed had a green comforter rather than a pink one used in the final game. The doll sprite notably seems to have been very different, with it looking less detailed and just much bulkier in general. For all we know, it may have been a plush toy instead of a doll, but that's just speculation on my end. Moving on, we can see that Ninten used to have a much larger yard than he does in the final game. The dog sprite may have been slightly changed, mainly on the lower half of his body, but the video quality is too low to really tell. Then we get a look of what I assume is Snowman, based off its milky white snow-covered vistas, where it seems it wouldn't have been as secluded as it ended up being in the final game, as the train tracks actually continue through the town, and it's a lot more open and city-like, opposed to the more rural style the town took in the final version. We can see this with the paved and snow-ridden roads, whereas Snowman in the final game lacks any form of roads. The tracks going through the town also imply Snowman wouldn't have been the farthest town that the train can reach, or simply that they moved the drop-off point to the right of town. The part of all this pre-release footage that I personally find the most fascinating is Magicant. Man, this is like Super Mario 64 Beta Thwomp's Fortress levels of different. First of all, it seems that the water in Magicant was originally a standard deep blue, when in the final game, it uses a lighter, turquoise greenish color. This change is likely to make the color that leaks onto the ground itself less noticeable and more natural looking. It also fits in better with the pastel color scheme that Magicant uses. Moving on, it seems that the wizard and witch-like NPCs weren't in Magicant. However, it seems extremely likely that this was just because it was an earlier stage of development, and that normal NPCs were just placeholder. Same thing goes for the swimming cat that seems to at some point just be a normal NPC. In terms of the houses in Magicant, it seems that they could have used red doors, while in the final game, they only used for special houses, like the hospital and stores. And that's it for the changes that I noticed in around 4 seconds of pre-release gameplay. Next up, we see Yucca Desert, and it's the same white plane from earlier, but we also see that the tank's moving animation was slightly different, which had a little pulsating above the tires, whereas the final game has all pulsating, thankfully absent. And the last piece from the footage shows Ninten and the party heading to Cream Puff Zoo, which the path leading to it is very different, and the pre-release shows that the path was originally decorated with trees rather than the flowers used in the final game. When it comes to Nintendo of America and localization, generally, they change a lot in game, especially back then. Virtually no game remains the exact same when it gets localized from Japan to outside audiences due to differences in cultural norms, but the Earthbound series as a whole is particularly infamous for how much has changed from the original version to the localized version, and this game's localization differences stretch beyond just a graphical update. Entire plot points and even parts of the games have been completely changed, so let's take a look. To start off, let's look at some graphical differences. These are fairly obvious, and in most cases, don't need much of an explanation. First, we'll look at battle sprites. We have the crow enemy, which in the original version was shown to be holding a cigarette. This was changed due to Nintendo of America's strict no-drug policy in their games. This also applies to the BB gang member, which we'll cover in a little more depth later on. And remove the cigarette as well. The Teddy boss fight removed the knife he brandishes from his sprite, once again, also because of Nintendo of America's policies about weapons in games. Next, we have Juana, Kelly, and Nancy, which are, let's just say, less detailed, due to Nintendo of America's policies on suggestive content in games. Majority of the battle sprite changes consist of basically removing small amounts of blood. We have the Nasty Zombie and Gang Zombie, which remove gunshot and stab wounds on their torso and replace them with a tie, the Shroudly, where it removed blood dripping from his hand into puddles on the ground, and then Dr. Distorto, which removes some very, very small blood stains from his lab coat. Nothing too big really, it didn't affect the quality of the game, but Teddy looks kinda dumb with nothing in his hand, as he's literally just gesturing at nothing. Next, we have overall character sprite changes, which surprisingly enough have some interesting stories behind them, so let's get started. For some context, the original designers of the game thought that the best way a Japanese audience would imagine a typical rural American group of people was the Peanuts comics. So a lot of designs were slightly changed to further differentiate the character designs from Peanut characters. So let's start with those. First we have Ninten, who had the bottom half of his shirt below the black line changed to yellow to remove the resemblance to Charlie Brown and make it more true to the character model. Then we have Ninten's mom, who had her hair changed to lose resemblance to Sally Brown. We have this dirty looking NPC that removed the clouds of dust and dirt around them to remove similarities to Pigpen. And lastly, for Peanuts related changes, we have this woman with glasses who had their hair changed to remove semblance to Marcy. Now, we head back into Nintendo of America localization policy changes, of which we only have one, the priest. They removed a Christian cross from around the priest's neck and replaced it with a basic necklace. Now we have some weird changes that don't really fit in anywhere else and are just kinda there. First, we have a man in a suit, a woman in a suit, and a younger man in a suit. They slightly changed the sprites for them whenever they're facing the side. The arms and the legs are in slightly different positions, and the woman in a suit also had the changes for the same reason as the glasses girl, to remove resemblance to Marcy. Then, the weirdest and most seemingly unnecessary one we have is the cool dude's back sprite. They literally just flipped his foot a little bit, nothing else. Why they did this? No clue, but it's different, so I had to cover it. Now for other changes that were made. In terms of these changes, a lot of them were just removing religious symbols. So I'm going to go through these really quick so that we can move beyond these sprite changes. First, we have 5 changed gravestones that remove religious icons. Then we have 2 statues that are really the same thing, but in different colors, and they removed a cross from coffins. Then we have chapels that had the stained glass changed to remove the Christian cross. And that's all the changes we have to do with religious symbols. And actually, all the changes made to sprites, at least the ones I was able to notice. Anyway, with those out of the way, let's move on. One of the few general text-related things I figured I should cover when it comes to this localization are the town and city names. Most of them got changed. In the original version, the locations were named after holidays. They were named Mother's Day, which became Podunk, Thanksgiving, which became Marysville, Halloween, which became Spokane, Easter, which became Youngtown, and Valentine, which became LA. Manitoy was originally Holy Lowly Mountain, Union Station was Santa Claus Station, and Yucca Desert was Advent Desert. Snowman and reindeer remained as they originally were. Then we have the BB Gang, or as we know them in the States, the Blah Blah Gang, and they're originally called the Black Blood Gang, and that was changed for fairly obvious reasons. Now, we have some map layout differences from the localized version and the original. Arguably the most well known is the Crystal Cave in Magicant. It was a lot less maze-like. The original one had the dragon boss who holds the 6th melody, and it was a lot harder to find and a lot more secluded. The cave was likely modified mainly so that players can see the dragon and are motivated to interact with it and see that it's important, whereas the original one you can go throughout the exit and not even realize that the dragon exists. Also, the path leading to Manitoy was made simpler in the localized version. The rock layout blocking the final cave was changed, and the layout for Spokane was changed a little bit. Now, basically, the entire end sequence leading up to the fight with Giygas and after the fight with Giygas are different. For comparison's sake, I'll be taking you piece by piece discussing the localized version and then the original. In the localized version leading up to the final boss, you'd go up Mount Atoy, get Eve. You would fight the robot which leads to Eve getting destroyed, get Eve's melody. Then you would go up to the mountain to George's grave, get the 8th melody from him, go to Magicant via the Onyx Hook or one of the XXX stones if you didn't get one, sing the melodies to Mary, and Magicant disappears. In the original version, after you got the 7th melody from Eve, you would immediately be transported to Magicant. Then Queen Mary will hear the 7 melodies and remember the 8th one on her own. Magicant disappears, then you climb up the mountain and George's grave does nothing. It's just for aesthetics. That's pretty different in its own right. But then the entire ending is different too. The original version, once you defeat Giygas, the party just turned around. No change in scenery, and then the credits just roll behind them where Giygas' ship once was. In the localized version, once you defeated Giygas, there is a massive epilogue that went on to explain what happened following the events of Giygas' defeat. Due to the ambiguous nature of the original ending, it seems that rather than from healing from his injuries and singing every night at the live show, it seems that Teddy originally died. So that's one massive difference between the endings other than no epilogue. However, most, if not all, changes made in the localized version were translated into the Game Boy Advance port, Mother 1+2, which also only saw a Japanese release. And lastly, we have some changes that don't really fit in anywhere else. The localized version has a run button, but rather than just making the party run, it doubles the speed at which the game runs. When learning a melody, in the original game there wasn't any background effects. However, in the localized version, there's this blue and red scrolling background for some visual flair, and also likely to indicate that the melodies are important. And lastly, the benevolent old man would originally heal the party of certain status effects, but was changed to an ATM so that the player can easily buy the items at the Magicant shops. And that's pretty much it. I didn't cover every single difference from the Japanese version to the localized version, as if I did cover everything, especially the dialogue differences, I would be here all day long, but I feel like I covered stuff that everyone would find interesting. If you know 100% of something massive I missed, there will be a pinned comment with errors I made and massive changes I missed, whether from the localized version or pre-release differences. If you have any suggestions for future Lost in Development videos, please let me know down below. I will be doing an Earthbound one soon, but based off of how much more is known about the development, which I obviously decided not to cover this time as it isn't all that interesting. Much more pre-release changes, and way more content this one, so I'll be covering smaller games in between this and Earthbound, also to help reach a larger audience with other games. I have a few ideas for which game I'll cover next, but I won't say quite yet because, you know, things always change, but be excited for that. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like it. If you didn't, dislike it, and even if you did like it, tell me where I can improve. If you watched to this point, thanks, and I'll see you all next time.